Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
I think I was supposed to introduce you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't worry. You're good. Take two.
Take two. Slated.
It's live TV.
It's all the infrastructure.
Hi, everyone. Are we good? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to SCI-Arc for the afternoon session of our graduate thesis reviews here from the SCI-Arc campus in downtown Los Angeles. And this afternoon, we're going to be seeing the work of 4 of our graduating students from the SCI-Arc program. The students are Abdullah Tassin, Jonah Klinghoffer, Alexandros Lewis, and Yihan Zheng. And they've been advised by Christy Vallier, who is here also joining us, our graduate thesis director, or graduate coordinator, graduate thesis coordinator. And they've also been advised by Tom Wiscombe, the second student that we'll see, who is our SCI-Arc programs chair, and also 2 of my own students. And my name is Marceline Gao, and I coordinate the Design Theory and Pedagogy postgraduate program. We're also joined from SCI-Arc by John Enright, who is our vice director, and Natu Fall, who is, I'm actually going to ask everyone just to say a few words of introduction when we go down the line. So maybe, John, can you just start?
Yeah, hi, I'm John Enright. I'm the vice director and principal of Griffin Enright Architects.
And Natu Fall?
Hi, I'm Natu. I'm faculty at SCI-Arc and an art director here in Los Angeles.
And Natasha Sandmeyer?
Hi, I'm Natasha. I used to teach here, and I've been teaching 2 years at UCLA, but I've actually still been in the building in SCI-Arc for longer than at UCLA.
And Kutanayada?
Hi, Kutanayata. I'm the vice chair at UCLA Architecture and Urban Design and one half of Young and Ayata.
And Tom Wiscombe?
I'm Tom Wiscombe. I'm chair of the SCI-Arc program at SCI-Arc, and I run an office called Tom Wiscombe Architecture.
And Max Kuo.
Hi, I'm Max Kuo. I'm a principal at All That Is Solid and starting as lecturer at UCLA Architecture and Urban Design.
And Christy Vallier?
Oh, hello, I'm Christy Vallier, SCI-Arc faculty and graduate thesis coordinator this year.
Welcome, everyone. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Abdullah Tassin, who will be presenting his project An Active Opening, and we'll have 40 minutes for the presentation and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Marceline. Thank you, everybody. Hello, so my name is Abdullah Tassin, and my thesis title is An Active Opening. So this thesis revisits and reimagines openness as a catalyst for engagement on various levels within and around architecture, and not just from a formal approach, but also a spatial, cultural, and ecological response. So Robert McCarter shares in his book, The Space Within, one of the primary themes of modern architecture articulated in its beginning by Wright is the idea of bringing the outside in and extending the inside out. We have no longer an outside and an inside as 2 separate things. Now the outside may come inside and the inside may and does go outside. They are of each other. And we can't experience interiority except against the complementary space of the exteriority, and that architecture engenders and embodies experience through the provision of a layered overlapping of interior space and exterior environment. So this territory of exploration is not foreign to architectural discourse. Of course, we have several traces in the past. Different questions have been raised throughout history, and one of the interesting ones is the infilade, for instance, from the Baroque period. For instance, is one where different spaces and rooms were made to open to each other and help facilitate large movements within buildings. And just kind of get inspired by that, I kind of turned some of the 2D elements of the infilade 3-dimensionally, and this becomes like a kind of a form of transitional space that wraps around the building and also acts as an exoskeleton structure for the building. So similarly, other interests have also attracted a lot of attention in recent years. For instance, formal fragmentation, material exploration, and also open plan design that all kind of have that idea of openness and extruding or like exposing the building to the outside. And you can see that in such a way in different poses in the building, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. So open architecture is defined in this thesis within a multifaceted discourse. So to help navigate this ideas, I adopted 3 design principles, or in other words, design guidelines to help kind of like root the thesis in some meaningful way. So the first one is break up building constituents, which is the idea of, instead of having extruded bunker-like buildings, which is very common in our cities around the world, which kind of promote ideas of monolithicity and consolidated buildings. This building kind of breaks up the building form and kind of exaggerates certain elements to expose the inside to the outside in one way. The second one is open the building outwards to the surrounding, and this could be done in 3 different ways. One is to open up to the pedestrians on the street level, which the building is currently located next to the Pershing Square, so it's a very public realm of a space where pedestrians would be involved throughout, but also it can open to itself, so people within the building can also interact within each other, and finally it can open up to the sky or to the world at large, which is another form of opening. And the third one is allow room for gaze, and this is a spatial concept. Allow room for gaze is essentially allowing the visual element of people's transitory experience to kind of penetrate through different spaces and allow for interactions within the building. So these are the 3 rules that guided the design process of this project moving forward. So in order to ground this thesis architecturally, a site was selected in downtown Los Angeles to design and rethink an urban design campus under the overarching theme of openness. So the building is located right adjacent to the Pershing Square. And by the way, the Pershing Square is getting redesigned, and soon a new version of it is going to get constructed. And the final proposal is actually done here in the physical model. So the first question that came to mind before attempting to design this project is, how can architecture create openness by encouraging environments that cultivate creativity, human engagement, and collaboration through the design of captivating and inventive open spaces? Here in so many great cities around the world, like New York, Chicago, and Dubai, you can see this kind of popularized, more conservative, let's say, approach of these kind of like extruded buildings that kind of promote, privacy and consolidarity and so on. The project here in this thesis is arguing the opposite. So the freedom of a movement, interaction, and the abbreviation of thresholds are the main areas of concentration here in this thesis. And you can see this very clearly in the plan, how there's different levels of movement that can take place throughout the project. So I essentially raised the entire project above the ground to allow for public realm to take place on the ground level. An invitation here to the entrance, which is kind of like a buffer zone between the interior and the exterior to allow this kind of movement. And also a very important thing that we're going to discuss also in a different slide, which is the metro access is actually through the building. So people, when they go to the metro in this area, they have to go through the project, and we're about to see how they're going to be their first impression as they move through the building to the metro. So. And also here in the section, you can see this very clearly in how, the abbreviation of thresholds and how, where's the inside, where's the outside. There's kind of like this kind of negotiation between these 2 realms that can take place in various ways throughout the building. Here's some more zoomed in pictures of the renders, of the section. You can see here, I essentially allowed an inverted dome to be symbolized kind of like an attraction point to the entrance of the building to allow people to be invited to the space rather than excluded. And in various ways, the building attempts to do that throughout. Here's more of the section zoomed inside. So here's the entrance of the urban design campus. So it's a school essentially, excluding the ground level, which is public realm and metro access. But this is where people enter into the urban design campus. So you can see there's like a buffer zone which is kind of like, it's not clear whether it's truly exterior or truly interior, and this kind of invites people into the building. And this is the first impression people get when they are leaving the metro, going into the project. So the metro is in the underground. As they leave, they are kind of bombarded by this view of the media center and the exhibition hall, which is kind of like a eccentric form. The backside of the building, you can see here in the model, that kind of emphasizes that kind of relationship. Here's some elevation from the Pershing Square, which is a very important open view side to the project. And here are some detailed chunks that highlight different parts of the building. This is, for instance, the office and the working spaces. As you can see, it's kind of open design layout with perforated facade systems and balconies that essentially go through the views. So you have the mountainside and you have the ocean side from the other side. So it kind of like allows this interaction with the surrounding in various ways. This is the central communal part of the project where most of the activities take place, engagement on various levels. And as you can see, the allow room for gaze is very clear here. People standing here or even inside there can actually observe what people are doing here. And this kind of interaction is essentially what this thesis is promoting. And this is the media and exhibition space, which is a centric space right hovering above the metro axis. So as people are leaving the metro, they are kind of bombarded by this kind of eccentric objects that float above their heads. And finally, this renewed interest in porous architecture places this thesis in juxtaposition to the traditional, more conservative approach to that promotes monolithic, solid, and enclosed architecture, which has swept large parts of our cities today and is largely governed by our dependency on electromechanical building systems and the desire for climate-controlled spaces. Now, again, this thesis is not necessarily proposing any solution to that big problem of the ecological solution, but it kind of opens the door for speculations to take place that what if we had the necessity to allow architecture to act passively without the need of climate-controlled or electromechanical systems. A thesis about openness would be a very good step forward to engage with that concept. And this thesis responds with openness as an alternative approach to rethinking contemporary architecture in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Well, just to get started, I didn't totally follow your entire presentation because there was a lot of stuff in there that could have gone a lot of different directions. But at the end, I really did get that it seems like your goal is to, in a way, resuscitate brutalism but with perforated walls. It seems like that because you're dealing with a very dark kind of monolithic aesthetic, but you're undermining that by saying that it's all perforated and somehow pushing towards an idea that buildings can appear to be fully enclosed, but that they're not actually enclosed. If I'm getting you right, and I think that was very clear and very intriguing at the end. Some of the other things that you led up to it seemed like a resuscitation of things from brutalism, especially from Paul Rudolph, like your angled views and a bunch of other things, which I understand it's in there, and it seems like you're into that, all good. But it wasn't until that end point that I understood that you are actually kind of, and it's not in an ironic way, which I think is good, that you're just sort of undermining the monolithic with the perfed, and you're actually saying, I think, you're saying that the enclosed spaces here are still spaces of the city, maybe they're still leasable, maybe, I'm not really sure what the program is of this thing, but that they're all outdoor. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, there is interior spaces as well, but there's the boundary between the exterior and the interior is blurred away, essentially. And just regarding your previous comment, the reason it's kind of, let's just say, dark graphite aesthetic is not necessarily theoretical. I mean, I have different reasons why I chose this aesthetic. It has to do also with my interest in space in general. I think this kind of representational technique accentuates that boundary between spaces, but also it's just it's an interest in this kind of color theme. I always like to experiment with representation techniques and not necessarily have many reasons to do with the thesis itself. So,
all good. I would still imagine the project
in
space where you are where you're working and where you're contributing, and it seems like it is an environmental idea. I think, as much as it is an
Spatial,
idea
cultural.
about sort of degrading mass. But I don't know. I mean, the environmental part, though, I don't know if you don't sound that convinced that that's a big part of your project. It seems like openness as a spatial idea, right? Not so much as an idea of like, let's say, saving the planet.
Well, it could lead maybe perhaps if other thinkers and people could continue working on this.
Okay. Because, I mean, it would be hot in there. It's black. It's a black building, and it's in LA.
Climate crisis is coming hard, so we have to deal with it. I mean, anyways, this is not the
No, but I'm
interest-
saying you're actually
yeah.
making it much worse. This is like a black body that's absorbing the energy of the sun and then re-radiating it to the interior. So, anyway, just saying.
An uplifting, positive note. No, but I think the issue of openness is a really interesting one, and as a kind of project premise, and I feel like there's a way of arguing the concept of the project in very, very different kinds of ways. And so this one is physically, formally open, but I totally agree with Tom. It's going to be hot AF, right? It's going to be hot. We're in Los Angeles. It's only going to get hotter. And so to the kind of issue of openness or providing an open infrastructure for a public, it would seem like you would want to provide opportunity for cooling centers, right? So that the issue of openness is not just porousness, but it's also open access. And so thinking about openness on the kind of fronts of thinking about buildings in Seattle or in Montreal, where because of the inclination of the city, buildings, if they want to do certain things, get higher FAR, they provide through access with escalators so you don't have to schlep by foot on all the stairs up the hill. Or in Montreal, it's so cold that they have tunnels everywhere and you can enter and pass through private corporate buildings that are not public, right? That you can pass through them as a kind of public amenity. So then there's the issue of openness as a kind of citywide benefit, right? And there might be some kind of offsets that you would get in order to provide those kind of openness. And so, there's a way to really think about this sort of layering of the idea of openness that is at once formal, that is at once perhaps rigged to urban policy, that is social. And I think that argument could be made and made really, really creatively and made well if it's really thinking through all of those kinds of variables. I mean, I'm on board with the kind of physical openness. I just think it would be incredibly hot. And so to think about a kind of open public building or open public spaces that would have access for all, it would seem like those would want to have shade or would want to have cooling or would want to have some kind of benefit that would also draw people in. Because, I was wandering around aimlessly before the review outside. I went to the bookstore and then I wandered, and it's hot, right? It's really hot. And so thinking about how to provide open public space that isn't private, and it would also be worth looking at the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which is privatized public space, which more and more of our cities are becoming right, corporate entities. And so thinking about all of those kind of interrelationships, I think would really be able to broaden the kind of narrative with which you speak about the project.
Go ahead. Yeah, sometimes, well, first of all, I wanted to say, it's an accomplished building project, which I appreciate, that you wanted to test and to be taken seriously in terms of the spaces, and it's believable as a kind of structure, and it's clear from the presentation. But your verbal presentation covers so much ground. I think we can pick and choose maybe what to focus on. I mean, obviously, in the title, an act of opening, and you keep bringing up how to make openness in architecture. I thought you diagrammed it really well. But at the end of the project, I think there's some qualities that I would have focused on more. Like the environmental one, I would have just said, no, that's not this project, right? We can all agree that it's important and it should all be in every project maybe, but you don't, in a thesis, I don't believe you can address all those things. You showed images of other cities, and you talked about extrusion and wanting to kind of battle that. And I think that's where it's successful. It's an assembly of scaled pieces, and it's really sensitive to the city. It's not trying to be a tower like the other ones. It's this mini in-between tower made up of pieces that you've invented that's kind of a trail that is obviously purposely at scale with the neighborhood and then turning up on the edge. If there's openness, it's really about the dialogue between these elements, the grid, the belly, the cut, the ground cut, which is quite interesting and quite nice. I think you've fallen into and fall back on a rendering technique, an imagery that I think I would have challenged, quite frankly. And so I would just leave it at that. Like, I don't literally think it's this color. I think it's just something that
You know, ironically, this is my wallpaper. I even turned Los Angeles into this.
It's off.
So like, I always love.
Your image is off.
Oh, here.
Ironically. Yeah.
You know, so it's like this kind of aesthetic is something but yeah, absolutely, I agree. I don't think the ecology is something that I focus on at all. I think the overall arching idea meant to like attack different territories. One of the main ones is societal. You know, we're moving into a society that wants inclusivity and openness on various levels. And I think architecture has to react to those questions. So I think in a very powerful way, I think this project also has that kind of societal response to the evolving cultural and issues that we have today.
Abdullah, I want to congratulate you on completing your thesis. I think this is a very accomplished project, but sort of responding to that point that your project is trying to sort of address this societal issue, or could potentially, I think I would have liked to see maybe a little bit more thought put into the relationship to the site, right? I think during your presentation, you briefly touched on the fact that it's adjacent to Pershing Square, and that Pershing Square was getting, redeveloped, redesigned, what have you. I think the project you've designed, that sort of street side of it, to me does not speak to like an open sort of space, right? I think John's point about, the openness being between the parts of the building itself and not about the building being open to its environment is more what your project is trying to do. And I think, I wish you also would have maybe gone into the sort of perforation envelope style. I think in your renderings, this one and this large one in particular, there's a really like great sort of textural quality that that perforation, the sort of envelope system has. And I'm curious about that, and I wish that could have also been sort of like pushed to give the entire building a sort of like see-through kind of really open like skin, right? I'm also wondering, like, when you were designing this, who are you designing it for, right? Because the building's supposed to be this open public space, but then there's enclosures. Like, what's the program, or what kind of program do you have in mind?
It's an urban design school. You can think of it like a SCI-Arc in downtown, another SCI-Arc in downtown.
Okay.
But it's also an access to the metro point. So the ground level is an entirely public realm, and here is the metro access. So people who want to go to the metro, they have to enter from here or from the Pershing Square side. So.
I understand. Okay. Great.
And this is what they get when they get out of the metro. So as they enter, as they leave the metro, this is the first thing they would see as they leave the escalators. So inviting the pedestrian in a striking way to attract their attention and allow them to be invited in various ways to the building.
I don't know, the more I think about your project, the more it can't have bearing walls like that. And it almost wants to be a glazed inner wall with this beautiful, thick, almost like, reminds me a little bit of, that winery from Herzog and Dameron? There's like these cages filled with rocks. It feels like a thick, black, volcanic, like curtain hanging in front of glass to get this sense of this sort of black blankets or like thick woolen, fabric-y like surfaces to clad and create what appears to be the cladding of the building, but is not actually the cladding of the building. I'm just trying to get to what is the specific contribution that you're making here vis-a-vis the dark mass in architecture. You are working on the dark mass, and I love this idea that it would be loose, made out of like loose rock or loose masonry or something. But then you could eliminate that whole other discussion about openness, I think. I think they're actually a little bit at odds. It's open, yes, but it's through like the sleight of hand of a magician doing an architectural envelope that's never been seen before. And it's not a sort of ideological idea of openness, societal openness. I think you'd find that very hard to argue if you were to talk about that same openness and then show this like at a city council meeting or something. I think in other words, if it's open to lay people, I think they're going to have a much different idea of what open architecture should be. So I think this is ultimately a disciplinary project where you're taking on the dark mass, and I guess I'd want to see really figure it out. So you can have air conditioning in this, no problem. That's not your subject. Like you were just telling John, like not your subject.
I tend to agree. I think the project is incredibly ambitious. There's so much going on that we're not even beginning to address in your project. And I maybe want to pivot to that a little bit, because if we're talking, I would also do away with this idea of the theme of openness. I know it's the sort of the headline of the thesis. But if we look at the image that we're on right now and the importance of that urban gesture, right, the connection to mass transit and urban infrastructure and really bringing in the social collective into your building, the opening in the floor plate is just a simple rectilinear opening, right? That is not the formal technique or repertoire that is resplendent throughout your project, right? Your project is really, what I'm drawn to is that sort of voluptuous figure that's somewhat iridescent behind this bent, folded mass, right? That's somehow a partial vitrine trying to contain it. So, I think there's a lot of rhetoric. Architecture is all about rhetoric, whether it's the way you're presenting it or the way you're rendering it as an image or rendering it in the physical model. Is it black on white? Is it white on black, right? But I think taking control and ownership and being more precise about, what is actually occurring in the project. And I'm wondering why we're not necessarily talking about heterogeneity more. I'm looking at how this building is being built up out of many, many different sculptural figures that might not be so compatible with. So the incompatibility of the different kinds of figures and shapes that you're producing and sort of piling on this urban plot seems to be very important, right? And it seems like the misfit between different shapes and the crackleture that produces is the kind of openness, the physical or spatial openness that you're after, but that's being produced by figure on figure rather than, let's say, a kind of swoopy, swollen gesture that's then opening up to the city, right? It's a very different, even when I look at the site plan, we see a very perfect, well-behaved horizontal plane that then is starting to be piled on. And I wonder if, we should enter the project in that way and really explore, the crevices and the interstitial zones that are being produced out of that figure-figure relationship. And then maybe we can talk more productively about whether it's visual connectivity or it's the different kinds of thresholds that you're producing through this, form-making process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just to maybe carry on from that, there seems to be kind of a part to the project that operates at the level of urbanism, more in line with your ambitions of kind of openness or new kind of spaces that deal, let's say, with the school typology as a new form of organization, its accessibility. And I'm referring to kind of the, like what one would call a podium, right? And as a new kind of podium, I think it's super interesting. I think it begins to maybe play out some of the intentions more successfully than the tower. When you kind of look at it diagrammatically, it really falls back on a typology that cities have, that you show example of. Any kind of city where it relies on kind of public amenity, more kind of a ground-oriented horizontal program, and the tower. And I think perhaps here the opportunity would be to really carry on that attitude that develops within the podium into the tower, Because if anything that really closes in our current arsenal of buildings and typologies is a tower. And I think like I'm far more enjoying the kind of the sectional view of your project with its intention to kind of reinvent a sectional organization. Not as much as kind of how the building kind of enclosure comes into play. And I wonder whether the tower is a necessary part of this ambition, and if it's going to be, as a project to carry forward, that it really needs to be approached, how it begins to behave at the lower levels. Because at the lower levels of the tower, you're doing a few things that are, I think, super interesting by taking the circulation out, turning it into kind of an object that wraps, begin to self-shade, perhaps begins to produce performances towards environmental kind of qualities. But on top, it becomes kind of fairly, kind of generic in some way. That is not to say, like floor slabs, etc., they should be out. But maybe they could be reimagined in a way that begins to alter how one experiences the tower. Because I think, in some way, all this ambition, like if the project is still performing in an A and a B, like this is where it succeeds and this is where it doesn't, I think it falls short. But if some of the traits we begin to develop begins to contaminate all aspects, however it shifts within typological demands of a base and a tower, then I think you begin to make headways. One last thing I want to go back. You mentioned kind of the term enfilade in your presentation. And, for a project that kind of problematizes enfilade, I think it's crucial to have a plan. And what it also means spatially in section. So I would kind of imagine if you did kind of a really planned drawing of your ground, that we would understand enfilade as a condition where you deal with urbanity on the ground level, and how it begins to produce spaces, how we go from one to the other as different environments, but also really take that on as a sectional problem, because if you're really blowing the tower apart, if you're blowing the typology apart, I think that kind of condition of moving from one space to another kind of space becomes absolutely crucial.
Thank you.
Great. Think there's just a few minutes left. I just would like to thank you, Abdullah, for being very focused this summer on wanting to produce a building that you have imagined in your mind and sharing that with all of us. I think the jury picked up on your intention and your ambition. And I think the critique is around areas where you can actually become more focused on those things and not necessarily have to answer to every aspect within every project that you're working on. I think the part that I've always found so compelling are, I think, the parts that Max was talking about, the aspects that, while you've titled it openness or active opening, I think it's the pressure that the architecture that is within this building seems to be pressing out to the exterior. That experience of that sort of inverted dome as you come in and slide in from the sidewalk, from the city. These things that are challenging how we engage with architecture, right? Which I think is really, really fascinating. And I also really appreciate the moment that you come out of the metro, you would encounter, this where architecture is not just trying to contain volume, but it's also trying to contain other objects. And I think that's really, really fascinating, and I appreciate your sort of thoroughness and sort of comprehensive presentation today.
I would second that. I mean, I think, having seen this over the course of the semester at previous reviews, and, I'm really quite impressed with the level of finish that you have taken the project to. I do also think that some of the discussion about openness and the kind of levitation of these masses inside of the building is something that maybe could have impacted the ground more. I think Max was pointing to that with the that kind of rectangular cut in the floor plate. And I think that really beginning to work on that thesis of like how you actually make the ground levitate in some areas or sink in other areas. I'm also really fascinated by the only glimmer of color that we get, that sort of copper iridescent form. And I think that sequestered spaces and sequestered masses are also important here. So part of this might also be about, you know, stepping back and saying, okay, how do I maybe now write the sort of statement of this project and really track it through the architectural moves that I've made. But I would also want to commend you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you.
So now we will take a short break and a change of scene for our next
Oh, I see.
student, Jonah
I was
Klingler.
wondering how we're going to do that.
Welcome back. We will now see the second project for today by Jonah Klinghoffer, who is advised by Tom Wiscombe, and Jonah will present Laminated Figure.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jonah Klinghoffer, and I'd like to start out by saying that I'm thrilled to be presenting one last time at SCI-Arc in person. I want to give a shout out to Tom Wiscombe and Marika Trotter for advising me through the summer, and all the support I got from my friends and family as well. So this thesis challenges the outdated 20th century model of the skyscraper being a vertical extrusion with a central core and fanned out program. And it becomes more exclusive the higher it extends. And so rather, this thesis proposes a flat mixed-use building where a program is diversified on all levels through the use of staggered laminated planes. So prevalent in major American cities, the high-rise typically includes a parking structure on the first 7 to 10 floors, while the rest of the building is hosts private spaces, leaving majorly only the ground floor for public use. And so what you're looking at are 3 examples of skyscrapers in the Miami area, which depict this model. And this kind of got me thinking on whether there are other ways to be looking at designing large-scale residential and commercial projects. So in August of 2021, California state regulators updated California's building code to require new homes and commercial buildings to include solar panels and batteries integrated in the construction of projects, with the goal of reducing and eventually eliminating the use of fossil fuels and replacing them with renewable sources like electricity. And so this model, yet to be applied in other states in the US, would potentially increase solar generation from 4% of the power sector to a whopping 45%. Thus, my thesis attempts to merge this dense model of housing with a sustainable typology of architecture that presents itself in the form of a power station. So this new type of architecture emerges, one that leverages floor area with height and length, allowing for a hyper-thin building with a minimal footprint. The design is lifted off the ground, 1,000 feet wide by 800 feet tall, and sits on a disc-shaped pedestal, what I like to call the island. The island acts as a public plaza for the city and downtown Miami, and a potential platform that addresses the imminent flooding that will occur in the future. And so this building bridges across the Miami River, connecting the Brickell Financial Center on the right with the historic downtown center on the left. Now, I wanted to look at the issue of housing density as a key aspect of my project, so I took a look at Robin Hood Gardens in London as a precedent of my project. And I wanted to kind of reshape this idea of dense housing back into the city in a large and hyperdense scaled building. Also, the wide open-air walkways that you can see in the concrete blocks were a kind of inspiration for the elements in my facade. Next, due to my design's sheer size, a clear opportunity was to use the facade as a nesting ground for solar harvesting panels due south. This project is located in China. It's dubbed one of the largest solar structures in the world, and it includes 5,000 square meters of solar panels on the roof. Next, the kind of two-dimensionality of my project required a method to articulate the facade and develop it in a specific way. Thus, I took a look at Zaha Hadid Architects' Pierre Vive project in Montpellier and how it uses a striation of glasswork as well as concrete. Not materially, but just the idea of having these different elements clash and create a sort of pattern on the facade. And this may also reveal the kind of spaces that happens inside the building. And lastly, this project Dockland by Both Richter Teherani in Hamburg was used as a formal precedent of my project due to the similar extruded platforms that I've used, and a kind of structural concept emerged from this that I was looking at. So the form of my design was generated by a collection of parallelograms and chevrons. And and they're staggered between one another to create a single holistic figure. The shapes are orthogonal, yet they follow a similar diagonal axes. And once assembled, these discrete shapes are kind of laminated and sealed together into a single silhouette. And they're unified by several textures and a thick black line that wraps around the building. So the object sits on the island, on the island, and this island acts as kind of a new elevated ground for the city of Miami. The south facade and the north facade incorporate extruded angular balconies. On the south facade, the balconies incorporate solar panels to harvest energy, while on the north facade, only a handful of balconies include this aspect and are clad in a material to resemble that effect. So my building diverges from the existing city grid and is slightly oriented northeast, allowing for new opportunities to inhabit the city and engage with the parks and buildings around it. The building right underneath it, this one over here, has a kind of architectural typology that I was looking at, which is prevalent in Miami, which is a large urban real estate development with a large walkable area, retail, commercial spaces, as well as 3 towers that stick out of it. And so looking at that model, I kind of wanted to combine that into one single flat building. So this kind of manifestation of a hyper-thin, hyper-flat floor plate was a starting point for my project. It's wide 40 feet, yet it's staggered at various levels. And so these long and thin floor plates beg for a new circulation model, one that counters the central core with fanned-out program, but instead is distributed in several cores along a single line. And one can perceive through these schematic plans that there's a constant shifting of spaces that occurs when moving between the floors. So going down and cutting through the island, you can see that it's, in essence, a 360 degrees auditorium that looks out to the city in all directions. The topmost floor includes retail and in this rotunda-esque space, and bridges across and overlooks the river. From the ground level, the island can be accessed through 2 large vomitoriums on either side, allowing the public to walk onto the mound as well as enter the building. And so on the ground floor, a rectangle is kind of carved out through the river to allow and host a dock for residents to hook on their boats. So going on to the facade, which is a key characteristic of my project, the building is designed in elevation. The facade itself acts as a tool to compose the exterior and interior. And so I do this by introducing a patchwork, which I mentioned earlier, of reliefs and crevices in the shape of recessed patios, extruded balconies and integrated solar panels, large curtain wall atrium spaces with open recreational areas, stepped sky lobbies, which are shown in blue, and a thick graphic line that tops the design by traveling through the surfaces, denting through them, and wrapping around them to unify these pieces into a single laminated figure. And so these schematic diagrams illustrate the kind of main concepts of my design. The ellipse base sits and hosts retail and parking, while the top of it becomes a step plaza that bridges the river. And so again, the notion of the central core is countered by introducing 3 independent cores with unique access points from the ground. And from these cores, you can access the stepped sky lobbies, which are aerated voids that cut through the facade and acclimate to the strong winds in Miami. And lastly, a kind of structural concept of my building is to include a trussed parallelogram kind of shape, as all these pieces are discrete and they have similar extruded forms. So taking a closer look at a specific chunk of the laminated figure, this piece contains residential apartment units, ranging from studio spaces up to 2 to 3 bedroom units. And so each one of these units has access to an array of outdoor angular balconies, which provides shade as well as energy in the integration of solar panels. And so here's a kind of plan that shows where these kinds of spaces would be located in. So the double-loaded corridor enables efficient access to all these units and becomes kind of an optimized model for this scheme of apartments. Next, we have the area that is the office and educational space, which is work. And so the representation of the office and educational space is depicted in a grid-like pattern that is expressed on the skin as a texture of recessed patios. And so what that would look like in plan is the floor plate is a bit more narrow, but there is space to kind of have communal gatherings in the exterior. And they have this modular block-like persona, and so you can one can eventually add these blocks together to create a larger kind of space. And lastly, we have the recreational spaces, which I like to call play. And so these spaces depict the recreational spaces for the residents of the building. The spaces include cafes, restaurants, auditoriums, lounges, and fitness centers. And these kinds of spaces are strategically tucked between the residential and the office spaces to provide kind of vertical communal courtyards for the residents. And here's an image of the plan of that kind of space. So it's 40 feet wide in floor plate, and this is kind of like the communal point of where this would be located. And lastly, a kind of combinatory chunk, which includes the sky lobby, a piece of the residential, and an atrium to see how those kind of interconnect and engage with each other. So the programmatic combination of housing, office space, and recreational spaces into a single massive building proposes a kind of alternative model from the outdated model of the typical high-rise. Intended as an elevated city, the laminated figure has the potential to repopulate the district it is sited in, while simultaneously providing an exorbitant amount of office and creative spaces for the area. My thesis project critiques the current state of high-rise architecture in downtown dense areas, as it suggests an alternative system of vertical living and thin living, and yes. And lastly, the laminated figure prevents a new kind of microcity that deviates from the rigid rectilinear grid of the city, with the potential of reshaping public gathering space for the city and rethinking what it means to live and work in the metropolitan city. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, I think this thing's fantastic. It's really, really interesting project. It's so great. When you brought out the model before your presentation, I was like, oh, this is like one of those facade studies. And then I was like, holy crap, it's the whole building, you know? And I'm like, wow. And then you checked that box of plausibility in my mind. I mean, there's a couple of things maybe I want to talk about, but I just want to begin by applauding you on the project. I think you are onto a kind of new typology, which is really exciting. The idea of taking, almost in a horizontal way, the pencil tower, we know that typology, and then making it really more an urban concept that's also less exclusive, I would say, than that type. A couple of things, like the way the building's sited, you mentioned solar panels. It's a little bit, I'm surprised it's kind of east-west, and I wonder about that a little bit. And I have to, because I have to talk about some of the technical things, because to be so audacious to do this and be so close, I think is important. Like the exiting and egress, like maybe the diagonals could have actually been like fire stairs that just rip through this thing so you could get two ways out everywhere. Small things like that. But I love the mixed use about it. I love the textures. The figures are really amazing. I mean, it really is like lifting up the city in this manner. Less convinced about your base. but I don't really even want to talk. I don't want to hit you on that one. It doesn't really matter. And then lastly, of course, the wind loads on this damn thing, right? Like in the pencil towers, they calculate it for all different directions. This one, obviously, in a hurricane area, but I don't know. Maybe it might kill it, but you need a big giant prop or something on it, from one side, or there'd be other ways to do it. Like I mean. I'm not a structural engineer, but anyway, really great project.
Yeah, an integral part of, a small part of the conversation I was having with Tom Wiscombe throughout the summer was regarding these circumstances, and an idea that was brought up and could have potentially been integrated was that these different pieces kind of hinge on the cores and have the ability to shift and adapt to the wind loads, but I did not explore that fully because it was not a starting point for me in the design, but it's definitely a fresh, very interesting take that I could have explored.
Sorry, how would it shift and adapt for wind load?
So,
Just if we're speculating.
yes, it's all speculation. So these, so this, this parallelogram, there would be, wherever the core, there are 3 cores, and so the cores would act as hinges, and so the pieces would kind of shift individually and move according to,
Like
yes,
vein. Okay.
yes, they would feather in and out.
All their sculptures.
Yes.
I dig it.
Yeah, I want to sort of echo John's point. I think this is really stunning to see, and we haven't seen, a few of us haven't seen physical models like in person, and so this is really nice to see because I think it's really well done. I think I want to talk about the shape of this thing, the sort of form you have going on is very dynamic. Like I feel like both in the diagram and the building itself, there's this sort of like movement the whole project has inwards or sort of towards that axis point that you had mentioned. And I think it's really smart that the axis is sort of directly over the river itself. And that the sort of facade that you've given this entire thing acts as a sort of programmatic diagram in itself, right? Sort of speaking directly to the city, explaining like what's happening, right, in each of these sort of parts. And I don't know, I know the podium isn't, I'm not upset about the podium. I think the podium's actually kind of interesting. It kind of gives it this like softness, right, in terms of the shape, compared to the sort of really sharp, angular, sort of jagged form this entire thing has. Yeah, great work.
I can follow up. I think we have to rethink the high-rise typology. It's a must, and I kind of like congratulate you on taking that on because it's very limiting, right? Like the requirements on a tower in terms of how you need to move people vertically, how far away you can be from egress, etc. Right? Like there's so much demand on how we can build that determines what it can be, and to kind of begin to think beyond that, you have to work with those forces. I mean, I like everything I see. I think it's a super interesting project. I think, just like you, John, when I looked at this, oh wow, like the students spend an entire, summer on a piece of facade.
Right.
I thought it was like performative panels or something, and then oh, it's the whole building. Oh, that's amazing! I totally got fooled, and became super interesting because in some way, the way how we understand towers in terms of repetitive horizontal floors that entrap us between two things got completely removed in the way we perceive the project. I think that's super successful. The notion of kind of the facade as a grain operating at multiple scales of opening, I think it works great. I want, though, the project to really take on questions of vertical circulation, egress, how to deal with handicap access, how to deal with dipping edges in terms of how people would get there, etc., as real problems. Because if we don't kind of like deal with those, these stay as kind of speculative projects. And I think it would be too much of a missed opportunity not to push on to the purest aesthetic of the project with things that begin to enable us to kind of really overcome its current bureaucracy. You know, there are limits to inclined elevators because after 7 degrees, they begin to get you to feel the jerk too much. And you have other forms of lateral movement that you begin to explore. You can begin to think about transfer floors where you switch elevators in a high-rise like this. In a new light, maybe you take a vertical elevation, but then you take something that begins to move you in a lateral needs. I think if you were to kind of really address those, I suspect your vertical circulation drawing is not going to be a boring drawing like we have right now. It might be the most interesting drawing you do for the project. The question of the lateral load, I think it's, you know, it's screaming, right? Like this thing just wants to collapse when it's hit from the side. But perhaps that begins to kind of bring the question of, okay, like, do I always work with purely kind of flat shapes, or do they begin to kind of bulge in some ways to give you lateral stiffness in the other direction? That might get you other kind of surpluses in terms of getting us out of the dimension through which we experience the building always repetitively, which is kind of the problem of the current tower typology. So I think I would kind of encourage you to kind of push beyond the kind of maybe the purity of the diagram as a spatial experience within the tower. I think in return it will give you kind of all kinds of agency to overcome the bureaucracy of how we deal with towers. Really, really kind of interesting work.
No, I want to follow up on that, like taking the egress very seriously. And, you know, it's I'm thinking of this short story that I just read, and I can't remember if it was Ted Lieu or Ted Chiang or Henry Liu, but a sci-fi writer who actually doesn't necessarily write in the future, but writes in the past sometimes. And he talks about the Tower of Babel and like this endeavor to really construct a skyscraper all the way to touch the floor of heaven. And then he talks about how it takes months to get to the stratosphere, and how there are workers actively constructing and moving material up, and their families, the construction workers and the families actually live in the tower. They've never seen the ground, right? So in terms of bureaucracy, there's also the way to like really follow the bureaucracy of this building or the technical requirements of such a building, to think that all the way through, to think about what kinds of subjectivities would it actually produce, right? Because inevitably, I think, when you talk about high-rise living or high-density living, the inevitable conundrum of where is the horizontal plane, where we gather all together collectively as humans, becomes the problem, right? And so, you know, I too don't necessarily find the the mound super satisfying, although I do kind of like how it's like a ninja star stuck like in a wall or something, right? It's just kind of like stabbed in there. But you know, you know, if we go and look at the sky lobbies and we start to look at the mixed programming inside the building, and we start to think about the vertical egress and how possibly they might not always line up, and if it's programmed enough that you don't actually have to go downstairs, you know, more than bi-weekly, then you start to get into a whole different kind of scenario. And at the end of your presentation, you talked about thin living or thin lifestyle or something. And I'm very curious, like, what is the impact of that? Rather than just sort of going through the checklist and solving everything as quickly as you can to kind of produce a probable project, I think there's something about the technocracy of this new type that could actually start to enliven new visions of what it means to actually, you know, struggle with this. And I think it's in the bas relief of the project. You know, it's so elevational, but there really is a depth in that thinness. And I'm imagining that this building is so large that the thickness of each trapezoid or each parallelogram is varied enough that it could start to produce new collective spaces, more dramatic than I think what you're suggesting, right? So if you look at that one, the large sky lobby, I'm imagining if this thing is terraced, who would want to get to the midpoint of that terrace, right? How far does it take to traverse that, and who would even use that, right? And are there new logics of privacy and refuge in those moments if you start to exaggerate those proportions and those dimensions in ways that reconcile itself with the overall megastructure of the massing? But it's a fascinating project.
I love the way that you took the laminate, like really drove it all the way through the project. Because when you were first, I saw your first slide and I was thinking that the provocation of how do you delaminate the tower typology and start to produce these kind of chunks that slide by each other. And I think that also, maybe tapping into what Max is saying about these places for collective gathering, that might be where you get some of these spaces. Because I'm fascinated as well by that idea that maybe when you call it a micro city, there might be days where you just don't leave, and there are enough sort of accommodations for the different things you would need to do in a day that you could stay within this tower. The other part I'm fascinated by is the idea that it's sort of anticipating the change in that environment, as you said, that the kind of podium is anticipating the sea level rise. And so I'm also thinking about the kind of shadows it might cast, how that might change the environment of the existing context in a really kind of productive and provocative way. I mean, I know probably there wasn't time to take all that on, but I think that would be maybe the next thing to start to look at. But I love it.
Shadows. I mean, I'm so happy to hear the jury kind of engaging practice as a place for speculation. I think that we're in a different time now where pure formal experimentation is over in a way. And I'm really happy to hear architects talking about how to go back into the world and like come back down to earth and talk about these things in a really speculative way. I think it's really cool. It's a big deal. And so it's so nice to see Jonah, you like go in there and really try to figure it out. And I think there are just a few rhetorical things I think you could have added to it to really push it home. Like I was when you were presenting, which you did very well, I was imagining you presenting to city council and like what they would want to hear or what they would need to have been seen hearing in public, if you know what I mean. And I was thinking like, for the first thing is massive housing, delivery of like massive housing. So many cities in the US need housing right now. And I think it's not just housing, but it's fully daylit housing that you're delivering through tiny, tiny thin slabs. And possibly other housing typologies like tiny housing and other kinds of things. And then I think the solar, John brought it up, and it is a little suspicious, but I think the fact that you have this like rotated, it's like not on the face, but it's like rotated out, so it's still southwest facing, it's still doing a lot, and I think that would be huge, just considering the amount of surface area. And then I think this thing about the lateral or the wind, I'm not as concerned about that. If I superimpose a rectangle over this thing, I think your thing is 50% open, both in terms of wind and also view corridors through the thing. And maybe it's not quite 50%, and I don't even know if 50% is the right number, but it would be a way to start to imagine this whole thing is not only facially designed, but designed to be fully perforated, which is, I know what you were thinking, but it's just a rhetorical thing to kind of say, you see this, but it also does this. And so anyway, I think the fact even that I can talk, I guess, about how you would present this to City Council is exciting to me. And I always wish this on SCI-Arc students and SCI-Arc projects, that I always think like we're in a time now where we spent decades really experimenting in this sort of the age of experimentation, I guess. And now the idea of pushing these experiments into this realm of practice, I think is really exciting, and I feel it coming strong right now at the school. So. Good job.
I was thinking of I think it was United Architects, oddly, proposal for 9/11, today, the anniversary. It was a bundled tower scheme, but they made an argument that it was multiple paths of egress, right, out of the bundle. So the geometry actually was supporting it. And I think what Tom's talking about is when we engage in practice, we have to think that way, like novel ways that you can bridge a formal idea with either something technical, like building egress, or performative, like cross ventilation and all these other things. You know, I mean, that's really very much the game. And if you can do that as a student and begin that, that's a way of thinking, I think, that gets you really far. So I'm all for it as well. And I said in the beginning, you know, it's a really accomplished project. I mean, but, you know, I mean, here's those lower parts, though. Like, there's a reason those don't exist anywhere in the world, because you can't get to them. You know, like anything that's like,
Oh, yeah.
hold on.
Yeah.
Like, I have to get up, sorry. But, you know how hard that is to do that? Like, I've tried to do that. How do you put a housing unit there? How do you get to it? And do you make somebody walk up and out? And then there's other ways. So you make a transparent stair that sticks out. Oh, you killed it. Like it doesn't work anymore. But those events, and I get also not trying to deal with all of it, you know, it's okay. It's like, this is an idea. This is the beginning of a thing. And those could be worked out later and would be.
No, I agree with a lot of those comments, and maybe I have a couple of comments that are maybe on the subjective end of the spectrum and on the objective. I think objectively, I think it was a really excellent presentation. I don't think that's a subjective comment. I think you were incredibly thorough. You have done an enormous amount of work in thinking through the kind of variables within each of these parallelograms, or, I mean, I like how you broke it up. Was it live, work, play?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I would say to John, like, it's no problem, because that bottom chunk, we're not going to put housing in it. We'll just
That's
put like
right.
an auditorium in there.
Pool in there. Like,
Yeah, exactly. I was like, done. I mean, I think the kind of depth that you went into in order to resolve all of those questions and really think through what it means to, in a way, deal with this slim living, I think the modules and all of the kind of formal, I guess, tests and experiments are super, super interesting. And so I just want to congratulate you on that front. And maybe here I go flip side. I think with regard to the kind of experiment of thinness, I think looking at the ways in which this thing is, frankly, pretty obviously going to fall over, I think there's an opportunity there to really play with, okay, if it is a kind of super thin structure, how do I maintain the most extreme version of thinness while also, in a way, buttressing this thing? And I guess I come from, you know, remembering when I was a student, my engineering or structures teacher talked about the Hugh Stubbins Associates, I think it was the City Court building in New York.
Yeah.
And anyway, the thing was designed for the wind loads in Manhattan. And then this engineering student, I can't remember what university, I want to say it was in New York somewhere.
It was Yale.
Was it Yale?
It was Yale.
I think it was Penn State. Anyway, engineering students like studying, doing a precedent analysis of the structure of City Court building, and he's like, I discovered a bit of an issue, and brings it to his teacher, who's like, oh, wow, that is actually an issue. And they eventually get it to the Stubbins team, and they realize they've calculated for all of the wind loads except for the kind of 100-year problem, in which case this baby's going to fold and buckle like a styrofoam, or like those starch-made peanuts. And so they had to go then retrofit the entire building. And so, like, knowing that as a kind of precedent, I think thinking about how to work through extreme thinness as you did programmatically, as you did organizationally, but thinking also how that kind of works structurally, because as soon as you get an engineer involved, often, if they're not on the kind of same design project as you, the thing starts to really bulk up, and the idea begins to, you know, lose its precision. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really fold that in, appropriate it, and say, actually, it is a real question, it is a real problem. Like the previous student was like, oh, I didn't want to deal with the environmental stuff that much, so you just say, this is not my problem. And I think today, in particular, that issue is not an issue we can just kind of deny, and where you're proposing a kind of real project, I think also look for the problems that offer opportunities to develop further design. And so I mean, I really appreciate the project, but I also think, like, thinking about the super thin blade while addressing the kind of structural integrity of the piece could have also brought up really, really interesting kind of design solutions that may have also opened up the problem of, oh, actually, I might use that corner that nobody's going to be able to live into and think about how to, jam the buttresses into those points, or do I just peel out the super thin skeletal kind of truss and I just float that thing in the middle, right? And it's all still super, super thin. So that is my one kind of subjective thing that I feel is objective, like wins an issue. Which isn't the same as saying like, well, where are your bathrooms in here? I think, there it's like, it's a design problem that could be creatively addressed. And I think there are a few comments that thought, as I did, that this was a kind of facade panel or a facade chunk study. And it ended up being the whole thing. And I appreciate that, but I also think at some point, some things do work at certain scales, and then when they get scaled up, it feels maybe a little bit too diagrammatic. And so it feels in a way there was a design time, and then the design time was closed out because you had so much to resolve, and you did resolve so much of that. And it feels like thinking through the kind of scaling up of the piece while wondering whether all of those objects do work at those scales visually, performatively. I'm not 100% sure. And I know that given more time and given more opportunity to just keep working through design, I have full faith that the whole thing could have gotten completely resolved. But I guess with design, maybe leaning back to Tom's comment about SCI-Arc's formal experimentational history, I think wondering where and how to address problems while also incorporating a constant ability to adjust the aesthetic, adjust the form, and really problem solve as you go, as opposed to freeze a design project and then resolve that. I think is something that as a kind of learning process and design process, really important to integrate. But I mean, overall, like super well done, really thorough, really unbelievably
That's such a great
comprehensive.
comment. I totally agree with that. That like I think one part of what I meant before too is that you can move the sort of creative nexus away from always being located over here in the front end of the project, but in the heart of the project when you're dealing with some of these issues, and start to imagine that that's where we can make discoveries, or that's where we can have weird surprises, and that's where the design gets reevaluated in the middle and not just at the front. And I think that's so true. I think like all the best architecture in the world usually arrives from that process. It's not just blown up from a schematic design.
Yeah.
So.
Except for Casa de Musica.
Yeah, true. That was literally just blown up. Yeah. Well, but then the counterexample would be Peter Eisenman's City of Culture, which is literally also blown up, but with other consequences.
And a team of 20 people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe a little more out of plane-ness, like, maybe bring back the butterfly thing a little bit more, a little more out of plane, a little delambing maybe gives a little more structural stability. So I don't know, just thinking through.
I mean, just thinking about like plane designs without fuselage, you always understand it by the thinness of the leading edge or the tail end. What it contains is enormous, but how it's perceived is minimal. So maybe the edges always remain thin, but you strategically begin to think about where thickness could develop. Because ultimately, like at the scale, thickness means very minimal to the proportion of its length.
Right, yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I believe there should have been more of a fluctuation between a kind of like formal design and the adaptations that might engage with when coming to structural and circulation to kind of ground the project. But yeah.
Well, I think that is our timer is about to go off. I just want to commend you and thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much for the feedback.
Nice job, John.
Welcome back. We're now going to see the work of Alexandros Lewis. The project is called Envirovore.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Lewis. My thesis advisor is Marceline Gao. And today I will be presenting my thesis project titled Envirovore. Envirovore critically provokes the idea that architecture is inert and transforms matter into living architecture that becomes an integral part of its environment. The project explores a coral cultivation facility and artist residency alongside an investigation into cultural and environmental issues along coastal zones. And the structure is located in the Isle of Skye, Scotland, near a town of Portree, an area that has established a false aquaculture of excessive fish farming, riddled with fish pens, allowing for the ecological simplification of life forms, the reduction of human work to machine, and the proliferation of parasites, changing the site indefinitely. And traveling north from Portree along Skye's archipelago, one would get acquainted with the meltfalls, a killed rock, plummeting from the top of a cliff to the rocks below, as well as the store, or as locals refer to it, the Old Man of Skye, a rocky hill overlooking the Sound of Raasay, and both rich in history and narrative. Envirovore aims to combine the beautiful and upsettingly strange nature of Skye and situate itself at the unique confluence of land and water, operating as a bioreacting structure. The building's performance consists of an irrigation system pumping water through the structure and out to its surface. The water travels through the capillary aqueducts into a water collection well and then finds its way into the water membranes and eventually reaches the surface of the building. The bioreacting structure uses tectonics to reinvigorate and study marine life. The manipulated skin becomes a host for marine life and facilitates the growth and acceleration of its inhabitants. While the tectonic capillaries that allow water to travel through are central to the diagrammatic vehicle of this project, the substrate that wraps around the building plays a significant role as the foundation for marine life to settle on through its coarse, rough texture, maximizing the ecological mechanism, changing the man-made as we know it, and the planetary as we discover it. The growth will consist mainly of coral, kelp, seaweed, and mollusks capable of filtering large amounts of water once transplanted back into nature. The selectively programmable structure is divided into three main parts, exploring a marine life research center and coral cultivation facility, an artist residency, situated on a plinth that is curved to fit these individual components. As you can see in this model, within the research center portion, scientists study marine life in spaces capable of extracting valuable resources, like via testing and the use of research and the use of a research tank, creating new opportunities for fighting environmental degradation along coastal zones. As a response to climate change, artists and scientists and communicators come together to stimulate conversation and the production of art founded in scientific research. I'm fully immersed in the environment. Envirovore engages its users to communicate on a human scale the urgency of the global climate challenge. The project looks at how architecture can be gradually transplanted back into nature and act as a mediator between the built environment and local ecosystems. Despite our resources, we can relinquish some control over architecture and allow nature to change its course over time. Envirovore's operational principles lie in creating a partially autonomous architecture, allowing marine life to become part of its actuation, a reconfiguration of space, as well as challenge what determines a person's physical placement in their environment once they've entered the tidal zones. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Alex, could you talk more about what's going on in these like, hybrid barnacle things?
Yeah. So, and kind of as I mentioned, the project consists of three main components. Two of them being the lower barnacles that will house the artist residency, and then the main building, which is the research center facility and coral cultivation center. And then these objects, if you will, are situated on a larger plinth, which houses, the water collection, a vehicle, and also the mechanics of the building, as well as an auditorium.
And is that, sorry, I didn't get this, is that an existing building, the cylinder?
It is not an existing building. It's all.
And what is the reason for the radical shift in aesthetic? Or is that just because the models, while it looks like the gold stuff is on the cylinder?
Oh yeah, that bar just didn't make it into the model, but I think the choice of keeping the plinth more monolithic was originally, the idea was that it would be kind of like the human element in this building that's kind of just like still like raw, and housing the mechanics that make the building operate. And I think it needed to be, these objects where the research part takes place and the art production, needed to take a different approach in their design language in order to achieve the aesthetic that makes the impact in terms of how the object kind of like contradicts like man-induced climatic events. If that makes.
And are those? Sorry, I just have more questions. I got that part. So, and then the plants that are growing in there,
Yeah.
are those actual organisms?
Yes. So it's all like live matter that will populate the building over time through the use of water pumps that bring water up through the structure out to the surface, and that happens through the capillary system.
And that's what the gold stuff is, the capillary system. Okay.
The aqueducts.
Sandra, I think your project is something. There's something really provocative about building this sort of structure in this sort of mountainous landscape. And designing it in such a way that the building almost invites the environment to sort of enrobe it or become this sort of envelope, right? So over time, you could imagine that the same sort of, the structure itself might actually like camouflage itself into the environment. And, I think as architects sort of designing something to get covered up, I think is usually, it's kind of counterintuitive, but I'm wondering if thinking about the sort of like long-term lifespan of the project, like what you would imagine the sort of capillary systems or the sort of like maintenance of it all being. Because, I'm sure like over time, I'm sure certain types of plants might start to actually become like a sort of problem for your capillary like system to keep functioning and sort of operating. And so how do you see that tying into the sort of like lifespan of the building or the project?
Yeah. I think the way I was thinking about how this would operate was speculative. Since the beginning, I thought that in order to like really like make an impact in terms of like how and design and technology can and take action when it comes to man-induced climatic events and the Anthropocene, and I guess the way it would operate, like it could, like it's partially tectonic and then partially an irrigation system. But in terms of how it would be maintained, so I mean the growth that develops on the substrates and the building overall is meant to be transplanted back into nature eventually, and then recycle over time.
Okay. So you're imagining the project is more like a sort of space to grow the environment to then put it back? Or, I guess I'm trying to understand, like, aesthetically, you know, the sort of capillary system is gold, it stands out. You know, it feels like it wants to be seen, but the project, you're sort of, as you're talking about it, you're saying that the system is meant to be covered up at the same time, and so I'm trying to understand the decision behind, I guess, the aesthetics and sort of how you see it being maintained. But I guess that makes sense. So there would be a team that would sort of uncover everything every once in a while.
Yeah, and then like filter the water as it goes. As it goes in it, and so basically just like giving back to the ecology that kind of like it gives life to the building as a whole.
So it's interesting because you could start to think that there might be a sort of like ritual or some kind of community involvement or in that sort of process, right?
I think so, yeah.
I had 3 thoughts, and I can't now remember the third. Like 1, 2, 3. Anyway, I have 3. I might only get to 2.
Okay.
And they're completely unrelated, although this might just be the 2 are unrelated. You know, I look at this, and the first thing I thought was like, oh, I hope he brings up Prince Charles's comment. And because when the National Gallery edition was designed by Venturi Scott Brown, Prince Charles lost his mind. Like, he just lost it. He wrote this letter. He called it a carbuncle and a national treasure. And I was like, oh my God, carbuncles, knowingly. Like, how smart, right? And so, you know, I thought, A, that was funny, although apparently it was just my own interpretation. But thinking about the kind of literal carbuncle on this sort of sleek object below in the model, because the sleek object below doesn't have the, what are we calling them?
The capillaries.
The capillaries.
Yeah.
The capillaries. I prefer probably the physical model just to have that very strange juxtaposition of the barnacle or carbuncle on this object. I think it's a really interesting thing going on. So, I mean, a couple of comments. It's super interesting. And then I'm always struck by projects that are kind of crazy, but then presented as though like totally legit. And so comment number 2 is thinking about presentation. I think this thing, I'm imagining it as yet another set in Inception, which would come probably after the snow scene, although maybe the mountain thing would connect too well. Or like a 1980s James Bond film, like yet another evil lair, which would be totally awesome.
I like that.
Or, I don't know, Lord of the Rings 4, right? It's, because you said it in Scotland, it could easily be in the, what's the valley called on the way to Machu Picchu? Anyway, it could easily be in that valley, like incredibly lush landscapes. It could be in New Zealand, it could be in Scotland, it could be in very few settings, but all of them really majestic and lush and remote. And, you know, and thinking about how to begin to kind of articulate a project that's designed to be a film set. You know, because in a way, when it's presented as a kind of super legitimate project, I'm like, well, I don't know, you could do so much more with this presentation. You could really deliver a kind of narrative that makes sense of what is otherwise a kind of strange yet very interesting project, particularly at the moment when you like take the carbuncle apart and you're like, oh look, and there's stuff inside. Like, it's unexpected, it's super interesting, it's definitely evil lair-ish. Like, this is where the kind of science lab would be hidden away in the remote lands of wherever, right? And so I think there are opportunities when you have a project such as this to think about the audience and not feel like you need to fulfill a set of expectations that require logic and reasoning to make what is a kind of fantastical proposal appear totally legitimate. I think there are ways of using a narrative or a kind of structure for what this thing is, to make it legitimate through, you know, arguing for it as a kind of filmic piece, or arguing for it as a kind of play between the kind of austere object and the object of absolute opulence or excess. You know, think about the ways of how you talk about projects generally is also a kind of, I think, should be much more incorporated into the design process and thought of as a design project. That the narrative is as important, because ultimately as architects you're always trying to communicate to a body of people, whether it's the architects in this room, whether it's the planning officers that Tom was talking about with the previous project, whether it's a filmmaker and you want to, you know, work on production design with this thing. Like, how do you begin to work through the idea of the audience with each piece of work that you do? And so I feel like there's an opportunity here to really deliver this in a way that would kind of engineer or shape a very different kind of conversation that talks about where this could go next, as opposed to, this is my work, I have completed it, now please evaluate it. Like, rather than think about, okay, this is where we're at, this is what we're thinking, how do we build on that, and where does it go from here? And I do love a project or a presentation that has momentum and that lets us go forward, rather than provide a kind of stopping point and say, assess. So that's just thinking about how you will deliver the work or deliver any of your projects in the future, and how you begin to really structure a kind of, I don't know, problem or question as a way of thinking, this is a response, this is the launch pad for this kind of a piece of work, and where do we go from here? I mean, I think it's super interesting. I just, you know, I wish we could kind of take it in a different way, different direction for the conversation.
Yeah.
And again, I can't remember my third point, but I might.
That's a very fair point.
I'll jump in if you get the third. Just go jump in.
Lost.
Well, yeah, I have some similar thoughts. I think I'm less convinced of the kind of architecture side of it, but I'm fascinated with the, let's say, duality between architecture and nature. And I think there's some ambiguous points in the presentation depending on model and rendering, but that's what I think essentially is the study. And, you know, its form is reminiscent of those pieces to the right that I assume are existing, like those tower-like rocks in a way.
Yeah.
And that's one formal shape that seems to be like it's camouflage in a way. And then the model, I am less interested in the real plants or that as an idea, because it seems like they would just take over and then your stuff is disappearing, you know, like it's a disappearing building, or the building in the mountain kind of thing. But in the render on the top, it gets really interesting because it looks like a more kind of alien version of nature. Like it's not quite of this world. And I think that's the separation you would really want to play with, that it's another kind of nature, but it uses things like capillaries and movement and things related, let's say, to the body or biology. And then that would be the rub. That to me, that's the thesis, is how the eeriness of that versus the landscape. And then, you know, people have asked about the stuff in the model that, you know, in the render is covered with the gold capillaries. I think that's too much of a contrast, you know? Like, to me, that's another kind of architecture. Like the cantilevered pool even is a separation between you know, something that humans have made and the landscape. The fact that it's cantilevered and lift off is also about a separation. So I think then just covering it with the same kind of stuff in a different formal language isn't as strong as these other parts of the thesis. I just want to keep looking at that surface and think of it and how it would be further developed, you know, without plant life. And its eerie positioning against the Scottish landscape. Yeah.
I wonder, though, whether one could take a position and be very candid about that duality, right? Like, there is the hardcore kind of architecture stuff as we know it, built, that's going to enable a future for this project, which basically promises that it will never finish. Because it's in perpetual state of unfinishedness. It might have its certificate of occupancy at some point, but the building never finishes. That seems to be the kind of interesting premise for me. What that does, in return is kind of puts tension in our values of how we judge what architecture is, can be. You might take a position if you were to represent these stages as set of scenarios, a set of scenarios that play into foreseeable future or beyond in terms of how this thing looks like, feels like, behaves like, transforms like, where at first it might appear outside of any of our index skill values of how we judge architecture. Like what's an elevation of an unfinished scaffolding? What's the kind of qualities of something that begins to develop life matter on it? At what colors, at what density, during what season? Right? So this thing in some way, like for me, the way I read this, it probably doesn't want to remain purely technical. It doesn't probably want to become purely natural looking, but somewhere in there that pokes at those two poles as kind of ideals moment of humans, either kind of binary relationship, there's nature, there's us, nature and culture, or fully kind of, overlapped and fused condition. But somewhere in there, agitating both poles as a provocation. Yeah. I think that requires a different kind of representational and presentational kind of stance on how we could show the project moving forward. There's nothing static about this project. Maybe each kind of conventional representation that we're looking at pokes at a different timeline. Maybe it looks at a different kind of its reality in the world, either as a model, as a drawing, but really not try to present a finished thing, seen as different vignettes almost, but really look at various features. I mean, I'm sure, you guys talked about, Francois Roche's dusty relief at some point where, you're looking at a dusty model versus the detail of how the facade might, right, very speculatively might enable that dustification into the future. But it's very smart, right? Like you're dealing with pure geometry. You're dealing an idea of assembly and detail, and you're dealing with how the building might appear in 30 years. And I think none of those images necessarily build a cohesive whole about the project, but very episodic notions of how we might understand and experience them over a long period of time. I think when we're speaking to the scale of, behaviors of nature, we need to think beyond scales of how we accept architecture to become realist.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I also am kind of trying to figure out a little bit why the natural performance of the piece needs to be connected to natural appearance of the piece. And it just does, so I'll accept it. But I think that's an important point to make because it's a longer discourse than architecture. Yeah. This sort of biomimicry front on the one hand, which says, no, the performance isn't necessarily related to the aesthetic, although some biomimicry people would say, no, it is. And then other people would say, no, there's this thing called nature, and it's a much more sentimental connection that architecture might have to nature in terms of framing views, or there are all these different approaches to architecture and nature. And I think because you're working on something that's so in your face and natural, almost cartoon natural, I think it's important to be super clear on where you stand and what sort of you can even be making a new camp, all good. You don't have to be in a camp, but I think it's important vis-a-vis the other ones. And then the other thing I was just thinking too is, what if this was like a prototype not just a one-off project for Thesis, but a prototype cranked up to like 11. And it's like, this is what it, when it's really maxed. But what would be like 9, 8, 7, 6, 5? And I don't mean dumber. I just mean like with the kind of the extreme overlaying of all of the information and all the systems starting to peel apart a little bit and almost turn back into elements that one could confuse more easily with architecture. Simple volumes or simple planes or other things. What would your capillaries do? And how would this thing become, something that's closer to a green wall that we could build, or you know what I mean? Like where would it be if you were to find out a place between 0 and 11? Where would that be? And the reason why I'm interested in that is because I think you might find that it would be creepier and more successful to have that realm to work with forward on new projects that you're going to work on, rather than being like, I'm the barnacle guy, and I'm going to stick barnacles on that thing no matter what, hell or high water, And that's what I do. So in other words, not reducing this to just the piece in front of us as it's designed, but to the logic and the other ways that it could exist in more stealthy ways, I guess, more embedded ways. So I think it's important for these thesis projects to be like a launching pad, you know what to do on your next project. And it'll be hard if you're like got this beautiful, perfect barnacle, and you can either have 1 or 1,000 of them, but that's it. That's your language, So, yeah. Like if I say you got to do a mid-rise building by next Friday,
Very
just saying. So, yeah. But I think it's a beautiful thing, and I love this. It sort of feels like. Do you guys know what magic shell is? Like that chocolate. Maybe it's like a 70s thing, but it's like the inverted golden magic shell on ice cream kind of pouring over, which I don't know, I love that.
Oh, I see.
It's chocolate on ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
It hardens. Okay, good. So one person knows what it is.
The one thing I keep going back to, the comment that you made, I think was something about, inviting nature to invade the architecture, which I think is kind of like just an amazing comment, considering that the history of architecture is about how to prevent nature from invading itself, right? It's about protecting ourselves from the elements, and the kind of solidity of architecture and tectonics that arise from that is very much about, that separation, right? And once you practice, you'll realize that water is the thing that you constantly have to create barriers against, right? That the penetrability of a building to water is what will ultimately damage it. And so your assumption from the very beginning is to invite water in. And so that's why as I try to sort through the project, whether it's, barnacles versus the vitrine or the cylinder or the turbine, and how it's sited, I just keep on coming back to this idea of like, where does the water sit? How does the water start to interact with the building? All this capillary action is kind of is sort of the idealized moment or the idealized method by which water interacts with the architecture and how the architecture constructs itself. But the thing is sunk in water, and so therefore is constantly, oscillating as far as where that tide line is. And I'm not really sure if this is brackish water, if it's oceanic, or what, didn't get too much into that. But I think that clarification of the project as far as like how is your proposal a proposal of a scaffold that is accepting water that then accrues and accretes over time, right? And I think as Kutan was saying, like there are many different kinds of temporalities to this project, and how its material chemistry works along with that. Like, do you achieve a certain stasis where, it kind of locks in over time and becomes most materially stable after a certain amount of years in this water with the vegetal matter and the biological matter growing over it, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I would really love to see how that works. Yeah. And maybe that's going back to Tom's comments about, there's the ostensible form that we see sitting before us, but there are all these other elements to kind of, that you can continue working on, right? And if you can solve, or at least create and propose a material that actually accepts water in that way, as a way to, in order for it to become stable, I think you become a billionaire, right? I think there are all sorts of levels that you could start to really play these things out, right, as an ongoing project, absolutely.
Well, that's a very thoughtful comment. I mean, I think just to kind of like touch on some of the comments, it was important to me from the beginning to like make sure that like the man-made elements of this building, like the capillary system. There's like like very like obviously like not like an ecological element, like and to stand out and maybe like use it in hyperbole, in contrast to the ecological aspect of the building, which is the growth and the water invading in and out, and creating that element, and kind of like how those things coexist, because like one is trying to get the other in a way. Because if we think about it, like in the epoch of the Anthropocene and the very obvious like impact that humans have to the climate, and then the traces of like of the human phenotype. Like I really wanted to make sure that the contrast between those two stands out, and also the building taking homage of its surrounding elements and landscape, and kind of like acting as a mediator between the ecology and the humans interacting with the building, and what that would look like, and how nature can become like part of how this building operates, and its actuation, and based on like what happens throughout it. So yeah, I'm like really interested in everything that I heard though, and it's,
I think Natasha's point about the narrative of this, or maybe thinking about presenting this or developing a sort of narrative for this, would be helpful for you, because I think a lot of the questions, we're asking like, how does this work? How does this work? I think you could start to get at by starting to like really get into the sort of life cycle of it all.
yeah, totally.
And really getting like nitty gritty and like really nitpicky about like the whole process, right, of this sort of nature taking over this building, right, or this structure. Yeah, I think it's great.
Thank you.
Cool.
Alex, I'm sorry I missed the beginning
Oh, no worries.
of your
Thank you.
presentation, but I remember it from midterm, and it's come a long way. I was thinking, what would Peter Nese think of this project? And the reason I say that is when I talked to my freshman about Peter Nese, I said he was sort of a speculative archaeologist, right? In other words, at the same time that he was looking at history, he was speculating on the future of the city. And he was, if he were an architect's architect, he would really be a cynical one, because in a way he was saying, if you let cities to their own devices and you leave architects to their own devices, nature will eventually just take over, right? Nature will take over. And there is something about the technological sublime. I don't know if you've looked at David Nye's book, but there's something about the sublime here, of course, and its connection to figurations of the landscape. But the speculative part of it, I think, is really interesting. And I don't know, maybe you talked about this in the beginning, but the phasing of this project, eventually, 1 million years from now, would it go back to nothing, right? Would it just sort of sink into the water, or would there be no more water left? And I think that the notion of sublimity and technology, I think, is something you could potentially really lean into here in relation to landscape and conceptions of landscape, but also in relation to some sort of Piranesian thinking about sort of speculation and speculating on history. Good work.
Thank you.
Alex, I'd like to really commend you on your dedication to this difficult problem of, so many of us, obviously the ecological questions that architecture is confronted with on a scale, as never before. So many of us are grappling with how to engage those questions. And so I think you really have, it's been sort of difficult, I think, but it's also really rewarding to see, I just really admire the way you push this through to this finish, this level of finish. And I do think some of the suggestions that have been brought up in the discussion about how these kind of entanglements between technology, architecture, and environment, how those might play out, and if you start to, in the future, work with like existing technological systems, like real technologies for filtering water and capillary systems, and start to look at some of those things, not as constraints, but as ways of informing further. And so, I think we have discussed many times that I don't think we're coming down on the side of this becoming a biomimicry project, but rather something that does have a technological plausibility. And so I would just really encourage you to really move forward in that direction. And so that it's not just something that is like producing an image of nature, but it's really actually able to engage with water, with soil, with other living matter that might, how the human occupants versus the non-human occupants might transform the architecture, I think is such a big question. And you've given us a glimpse of how that might happen. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So we will take another short pause, and we have one more project. Han Zheng. we will now see the work of Yihan Zhang, a project for the Natural Futures Museum in Los Angeles.
Hello, everyone. I will gonna play my blog to explain what is my thesis, which is called Natural Futures. My channel, this is Yihan Jane, and today I got some free time, so I come to the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum because I heard there's an AR app recently called Natural Futures can change this Natural History Museum to a natural future one, which sounds really interesting. According to their ad, it said the AR app will let you become a future archaeologist to explore the future we might come from based on our present. It can train users to see the world augmenting and live the museum with an augmented consciousness. What does that mean? So let's go explore it together. The first scene is in the emblematic entrance to the museum inside the Artist Booth Pavilion. In this space, the Natural Futures Museum AR program provides a glimpse of the future of nature, a simulation of the ocean environment from below the surface of the ocean. The experience begins with a whale swimming around the facade that appears when users standing in front of the entrance. After entering the cube, users will see the sea level rising, which is currently happening, until it overwhelms all the people staying in this area. With a glimpse, the natural future world is occupied with glowing microorganisms, a whale skull, and plastic corals. New ocean vegetation also starts growing in this space. This experience will invite museum goers to reflect on the possibility that all of the currently existing architecture will eventually become immersed by oceans, driven by sea level increases caused by global warming. The second scene, situated in the Gem and Mineral Hall, creates future fossils and future minerals, virtual entities that are designed to trigger users' imagination of what remains we will leave for the future humans as history for them to study. In order to imitate an archaeologist's working process, the app allows users to explore various types of niches within future fossils in the walls. By simply tapping and pinching on the screen, users will exaggerate niches in the physical world. The design prototypes are plastic, bones of farm animals, and architectural ruins that exist in the present human's daily life. In the future, this will be transformed into fossils and become part of the minerals that exhibit to future humans. At a first glimpse, the user's view of the app will be a more immersive and aesthetic experience designed to attract people's attention. But as users go closer to the AR experience, they will also find it is disturbing and horrifying. Augmented reality can engage you as a viewer in different ways and with varying spans of attention. Only if people really work with the augmented reality experience and go deep into it can they discover higher resolution and other layers. This layering creates a more profound engagement between the architecture of the museum and its technological augmentation. The location of the third scene is the dinosaur hall of the museum, where people have to pass if they want to exit the building. This scene simulates a virtual wildfire happening in the surroundings. It illustrates how time and human behaviors radically change nature, thereby encouraging people to take responsibility for recovering the environment. Virtually peeling the interior walls of the space away creates the visual effect of curtains opening, revealing desert plants stretching and sprouting from within. As the skylights and cracks gradually extend onto the upper walls and ceiling, a sky turning blue from orange color will be revealed. At the same time, wildfire is burning virtually in the surrounding space. This virtual scenario implies the historical condition of how wildfire invaded the land in California. As you tap the button feature on the screen, the scene will prompt another mode to transform the space. The place where users passed by and were scanned by the camera of the AR device will be covered by a virtual future world. In other words, the space will change according to the user's walking path. You can also tap the screen to add future flowers and interact with them. Are they future architectures? Finally, as if horizon showing the present, the how merges different layers of time zones, the future and the history. By shrinking the time scale, the dinosaur hull becomes a container of these virtual fossils and artifacts derived from human debris and makes it possible to record information similar to physical functions. Okay, and now let me play this with you to show you how to play with the app. So now I'm showing the first scene. That's how the vegetation growing. And then you can see the space will occupied by organisms or some unknown. And the whale has died, so it's virtually swimming. And the organism also, maybe they have some memory of the whale, so they group like a whale. Okay. And then now I'm showing the second scene, which is the niche of the future. By simply tap on the screen or pinching it, you can scale it up or down. I make it can be scaled because I really want people to get into it after the first glimpse, so you can find the horrifying. And you can find, when you're looking closely, you can find some like skulls and architecture ruins in the niches. Plastic bags and bottles. Yeah, it will play randomly, so you won't know which one you open. And then I'm gonna show the third scene, which is the new world. Now our ceiling has peeled off, and the wildfire has been stopped. So the flower growing. Now the flower, the the plants. Oh, oops. Do this. Oops. And then when I press the present, we can see the future world among the present. And also, yeah, just able to interact with this. That's how I imagine what probably be our future architecture. Yes. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your watching.
Sorry, yeah, could you just maybe in a sentence say what your thesis is or what it's trying to do, the project? Maybe just the elevator pitch, what would it be?
It's an AR app that trying to reinvent the Natural History Museum to a Natural Futures Museum in a virtual format. So I imagine every one of the users will be an archaeologist from the future. So I was thinking what stuffs we will leave for the future humans to study, and what kind of fossils we will leave for them to study, like how they know us, know or human, this
and
generation.
Is the space within that future world? What's at stake? I guess what's the architectural stake, right? In other words, what can architecture learn from this technology?
I think, maybe in the future, part of the architecture can be virtual, in a virtual way, like it can be built partially, and also, or it can be interact with people, and also it can support people spatially, yeah.
Do you imagine maybe in the future that we wouldn't have to carry, like there wouldn't be this interface, it would be maybe more embedded somehow?
Yes, I believe that will be happen.
Yeah.
Because this one is like designed before that happened. So probably now I have to take the iPad, which is like not that convenient. But I think in the future we can like by the naked eye to look and look different future in the architecture.
Yihan, I want to first commend you on completing your architecture thesis. I think I really enjoyed your form of presentation, sort of the vlog and like live sort of demo combination. I think was really smart. And I think that the sort of AR game or the experience that you've designed in itself is really interesting. You sort of force the viewer or the user to really come to terms with the sort of climate change, effects that we're all sort of looking to or kind of expecting or anticipating to happen in the future. And like, having that happen in this sort of natural history museum, this idea of sort of collapsing both the future and the past to start to like, you know, maybe think about how we can start to progress forward with those topics, or with that topic in particular. I think my one critique for you might be the sort of like cute but creepy aesthetic that you've employed. I don't know. I think there's something to the sort of like gamified aesthetic, but I think that you maybe could have pushed that a bit more and start to maybe get at a different kind of aesthetic that still remains in the sort of like AR, like gamification world, but that might be a little bit more like complex, you know.
Thank you for the comments.
Yeah.
I have to say, I really appreciated the whole, I want to call it a performance, because at the end we were watching you dance, and if you weren't looking at the screen, it was like, this is totally awesome. Like, there's someone just performing in the space, and this is architecture, right? It's totally up my alley. And so, I mean, I think what was really interesting about the kind of whole piece is, as soon as you hit play, first of all, the audio was amazing, and it felt like we were transported into the National History Museum, because these speakers were kind of echoing in here, and it sounded also like the audio in a Natural History Museum when it's bouncing around the sort of hard walls of a volume. And I thought, oh, it's going to be an entire tour, right? And for the most part, it was in the video piece, right? And I think what was really interesting about that, when we look at the Natural History Museum, and I think here's where maybe you didn't take enough advantage of the kind of setups that we see in the Natural History Museum, which are always these windows, these portal windows into which there's a kind of scenario or scene built behind the glass. And we're looking at an object which might be a mammoth or I don't know, some fighting scene between some peoples. I don't know. And then there are all of the, often there's a mural, there are a couple of sculptural pieces that are the element of the scene, and then there's all the stuff in front, which is called the fake terrain. And that all kind of substantiates the fiction of that room, right? And then you go to the next one, and it's always like a diorama. And I think what was interesting about this piece is that the diorama also becomes then this kind of digital overlay. And so I really appreciated, particularly, I think the moment where we all like, whoa, when the water rose. And I feel like those moments could have been also stretched out a little bit, so that we're really meant to feel the impending doom of the water rising, where it's like, oh, the water's risen, you're drowned, huh? Yeah. But the technology also could be used more performatively, so that we're really forced to, in a way, experience some of those scenarios that you set up, so they could be much more, I guess, spatially experienced. Because when you see it on the screen and we see this happening, like when the water rose and we were kind of in it, it's like it's a real moment, right? And I think that's an extremely effective world and space to be in. And for me, the project felt very much a world building piece of work. And so for that, I thought it was a kind of really successful series of performances, of experiences, and of designs within the context of the Natural History Museum or Natural Future Museum. And so I think also really clever overlay between those two kind of realities. So, I mean, I thought, do I love the aesthetic? Not really, but it also doesn't matter, because all of that stuff I think could be worked on, could be resolved, could be also part of thinking through whatever it is that wants to be explored. But I really love the whole kind of conception and execution of the piece, and especially this kind of performance and delivery. I thought that, to deliver a thesis piece of work as a kind of multi-part experience was really super well done. So I just want to commend you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that part. Would have been even better if you weren't there at all,
Yeah.
And then you just walked in after this was done on the screen. But kind of what I'm left with, and I'm wondering about this eventual future of ours, where AR, VR is going to be, part of our lives, already is there's a question left behind by fully embracing AR at the center of an architectural experience. That is, what happens outside of it, right? Because when you're within the interface, you're experiencing one thing, and the reality of not being in that interface would have somewhat of a consequence in an architectural physical reality. Meaning, if all our value system of how we judge the world, experience the world, shifts into a virtual domain, the current values we have within the physical have to shift. They either get devalued, get reconsidered, manipulated into things that are currently not, whatever that direction might be. So, not to turn this into a binary problem, but I think there is kind of the other side of the token here when you work on a project like this. What happens to the physical real next to the augmented real? And I think maybe as another layer to contemplate what the space of the museum actually would look like to somebody who is not in that interface, meaning that if I'm really feeling like the room is burning, right, I'm running away, or am I drowning? I mean, you've seen these videos where people wearing the headsets acting not aware of their spaces, not aware of their surroundings because they're immersed in a certain experience that makes them respond in a particular way. Architecture never does that unless you're walking on glass or maybe other things that are not used to. So I'm really curious what would be the other side of this experience, like to witness people who behave like they wouldn't in a normal building, and whether or not that in return facilitates the physical environment that an architect designs, regulates, enables to become something other than we currently value and determine.
I like that you chose the Natural History Museum. That's such a, to me, it's a kind of strange thing anyway, like nature's history that we would go. And I'm surprised you didn't use the dioramas, like, I mean, the idea of a diorama, is that we see, whatever, a prehistoric scene or even a reenacted one with its weird taxidermy and all sorts of stuff. And it's smart to use that because in many different, the dinosaurs, all of the kind of history, I guess, of the planet, based from artifacts or recreated. And then I get why you would say, okay, well, this is about the future, like future natures, right? Yes. And some of them could be heuristic and, like, okay, I'm going to teach you something here about, water, or what does it mean when we say the water's rising in a physical way? And I agree that was really one of the most powerful ones. And then I think other ones, I do agree, I wish it was slower, like a little bit more paused, a little not, it's kind of chaotic in a lot of ways. A little bit, maybe you didn't need to do all three so scenes embedded. But the potentials of this are really interesting. I was thinking about the word, augmented reality, which to me in the word is meaning that there's still reality, but you're adding a little bit to it, right? Like the kind of Pokemon Go, like reality is reality, but then there's this other thing. There were portions where you've completely made a new reality. I wouldn't call it augmented reality. I would call it another virtual, with like every surface, except maybe people, is subsumed. And I just find that interesting. Is that really augmented?
I agree with that, John. I was going to say the exact same thing. I feel like at some point it got so immersive that it felt theatrical, like either being in cinema, watching a 3D film, or being in a VR cave world. And I just think if you keep working on augmented reality, I think it really, I'm so interested in it, because I think for that reason, John, that it's going to be the kind of things that creep up on you where you can kind of tell sometimes that it's an overlay on reality. Other times you're not quite as sure which is and which isn't. And I think that's going to be the sweet spot for architects to operate in. I think when it's filling an existing shell of architecture with VR, then we end up with like the holodeck from Star Trek. But if you think about the idea of needing to design, like you're asking for, Kutan, the physical reality, and also leave almost like, I imagine almost like unfinished parts of physical reality that can be finished by the augmented world, that's like a whole frontier for us to work on. And I think it's going to take, like a lot of people have been asking for, a bit of a lighter touch, I think, than sort of filling the entire thing with animated pieces. It might be much more strategic, the things that you would work on.
Yeah, I think there's what's compelling about your project is it really could be taken in two different disciplinary directions, right? Like, I feel like if you go the architectural route, there are a set of questions and implications on value systems, et cetera, that are super compelling. And I'm thinking of, for example, the little crenellated digital rock things that you're pinching and zooming and enlarging, et cetera. And how that, I think the most compelling moments are when they start to mess with where the optical plane is, right? Like what's convex and what's concave, and then how different images are nested within each other. And I'm very curious how that might start to translate into an architectural language, right? Where, let's say, for example, as you're wandering around in the museum room, you see the physical floor, but then there's an implication of another horizontal plane. And like, how would you actually instance that in a built environment is super fascinating to me. But on the other hand, if it's about AR, then I wonder if it is about like the Natural Futures Museum, why go into the Natural History Museum at all? In the sense that, like, John's absolutely right. Like, this is a super compelling sort of museological environment with its own techniques of spectacle and pedagogy, right? That it uses the vitrine or the diorama, et cetera. But AR proposes a completely different set of educational interfaces. So I'm imagining, like, if it really is about climate disaster and starting to model what climate disaster might look like, and we're not exactly sure because there are variables and feedback loops that we haven't exactly accounted for in every single scenario, then you could just be walking throughout the city, right? And you have your AR, and you'd be like, okay, if this 100-year storm that's now happening every 8 years, right? Like this is what could happen. And then this could be an endlessly modifiable model that can be instanced through the AR, which I think would be super fascinating, right? To envision these things in our everyday realities. Like that clash between the phenomenal and the everyday is what's so promising, I think, in this kind of work. And I double down on the cute and creepy too. I really like that aesthetic. Yeah, go play that up.
I mean, to kind of counterpoint, I really like that it's in the Natural History Museum, in part because it really acknowledges and embraces the idea of everything situating itself on a continuum, that we are here on a line, and what goes before is affected deeply by what comes is affected by what was before, and in a way understanding causality and understanding the ways in which archaeology and the understanding of history are complete narratives, right? That the understanding of archaeology changes the second that a new discovery is made, and it completely undermines the thing we thought we understood and becomes a different kind of story. And so I really love that all of it is, in a way, a kind of propositional or speculative understanding of the world, whether it's future or past. And so for me, I really do like the placement in there. There's something else, man. Today's the day of lost trains of thought.
It's all good.
Do you know the photographs of Hiroshi Sugimoto, the dioramas that are taken in the Natural History Museum in New York? And they're photographs of the dioramas taken through long exposure. And it immediately kind of takes that fiction and situates it like 4,000 years apart from the scene that's in front of you, because it's a photograph, right? So it must have existed in the last 150 years. And just that, transposition, right, completely kind of transforms your notion of the reality. And I think It's that kind of tease perhaps within the technical and where you situate certain events along the line. It's not linear, and I think you're kind of trying to make that point. You can jump forward and back. And to be able to kind of maybe situate that more within the familiar aesthetically, less within, let's say, just at this point, maybe it's what the visualization allows you to do in the kind of rendery feature. But to really think about, okay, what's the conventional visualization through which I could construct a narrative that allows me to enter it more directly? Like almost a hook, right? Like not clearly stating, this is virtual, this is real, but that tension that overlaps.
Well,
I agree. No, I was just going to say to that point, I think, you know, a couple of times now I've heard you haven't sort of employed the sort of diorama representational technique, but I'd like to argue that, I would argue that you did in the sort of future fossils scene, but because that sort of diorama space was one, like, kind of shallow, and two, filled with things, like, to the brim, I think it was kind of hard to understand it as a diorama in the traditional sense. But I think if you were to revisit that, I think, you know, maybe employing some more like realistic kind of rendering techniques to the sort of components that you had in there would make that like so much more effective, because, you know, there was, like you said, like building components and, you know, other like ruins and things like that, that we could start to actually, you know, really understand that as being like fossils that might be found, you know, thousands of years from now. Yeah.
I like the idea that this thesis could, you know, be AR as museological critique, right? Tool for critique of museums at large. So what would this be like if it were taken to the Met or the Museum of Modern Art, or right? And I think that would be interesting if you think about thesis as the end of the beginning, right, of the rest of your career. You know, can this be a kind of part of a larger project of thinking critically about museums? And that's why I was asking what the architectural, you know, component of this is, right? And I think that would be super fascinating, right? Like you hand one of these guys to, and then again, if we were fully embedded, then maybe it'd be a chip or something, and we'd be able, it'd be programmed in a certain way that we would be able to take this with us to different museums around the world, and there would be the questions at stake would be different, right, than these particular questions, right? So maybe we're not drowning anymore, but we're mummified, or, you know, something else. And I think that the museological aspect, the questions of the role of museums moving forward, is another really rich potential, right?
And I just realized the reference I was thinking of, which I bought this book at the comic book store over there. I don't know if it still exists. Otherwise, I'm sure Hennessy and Williams has it. But there's a book called Here by Richard McGuire, and it has no words. It's, I don't remember how many, couple hundred pages. All the cameras set up, looking at a corner of a living room, and that image is there for every single spread of the book, but the date changes. So sometimes we see that room in 1958, sometimes we see it in 2,300,052 and whatever, and it goes backwards and forwards in time, and it's not chronological in the book. Every page jumps, and then there are cutouts, and so we might see that living room in 1984 with an inset of it in 1493. And thinking about the kind of constant and the linearity and the capacity to overlay narratives and spaces and times on top of one another. I've always loved that book for the kind of AR feel, but in a completely, you know, book format. But I think it would be a really useful precedent to look at, understand, or I guess to help push the idea of the sort of capacity for a space to begin to narrate, as well as how you begin to overlap all of those timelines. It's called Here. And that has a very similar kind of quality.
I will go check it.
Yeah, I think the suggestions about completion and the way in which architecture could maybe anticipate the presence of augmentation and how it might actually like feed back in a way so that what you design could be designed. I think Tom was saying this, you know, the completion aspect, that something would later maybe be present or not, depending on if you have the augmentation, but that there would be like an interlock between them. And I think you came closest when you were in the Mineral Hall. I really appreciate that scene where we could see like the physical entities, the fossils, and then you augmenting with the digital fossils. And so I think taking this forward and saying, okay, now, you know, in this project you're working with an existing building, but in the future, really designing the architecture that will kind of, you know, maybe receive is the wrong word, but will meet this augmented material, I think would be just fabulous. And, you know, the other aspect, I think this project really, by sort of moving into the Natural History Museum, and I know you were there like every week. Johan was going, that was like her site. She was really working in there, filming these AR, and you were just so relentless with the development, because I know that technologically it's pretty complex what you've achieved. And I just really want to commend you on that perseverance with that. And it's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Congrats.
Thank you.
So our guests are invited to the spin room for totally voluntary, like some closing comments, just to talk about what we saw today, you know, on this session or earlier sessions.
Cool.
Share with
Thank you so much.
your thoughts. That's down in the gallery, I believe.
That was a very polite arm twist.